Okay. Now we're opening the seals. Now, do you know what a seal is?
Will.
What?
Your will.
Well, no, not a will. The wills are sealed. Very few people could write their names, even fairly wealthy people and all. And they would have a stone impression or metal with their identifying seal. This stayed in Mediterranean and European culture until well into the 15th century, people did. And when you wanted to signify ownership, for instance, there was a trireme ship, oared ship that was recovered off of the southern coast of Greece several years ago. What I know about shipping and ships in the ancient Mediterranean world, I learned from a Biblical Archaeology Review weekend in Fort Worth, Texas, and they had the world's authority on underwater archaeology of the Mediterranean, and he elucidated a whole lot of things that came in handy when I was translating both the Gospels and the book of Acts. He described in detail. And in this ship, they had these amphora. They are jars shaped, kind of rounded at the bottom and getting wider, and then neck and on top. And they would carry oil and wine in them. And they would fill them with wine. They would put them in a ship with a round place to nestle the bottom in, and fasten the neck to the side of the ship, pour wax over it, and then they would put the seal in that warm wax, and that meant that wine or oil belonged to a person. And there is a pun in this section of the book of Revelation. The seals represent the inviolability of the will, the 7 seals on the side of the document, but the seals also represent the ownership of God that we're going to get to now. And it's very common in the New Testament to find puns or plays on words that way. It's almost impossible to translate. I know. I have maybe in dozens of places, I may have been able to preserve the pun in 2 or 3. I can't remember how many, but that's right. So that's what's going on here. We just opened the 6th seal. No, the 5th seal. I saw, this is in the 9th verse of the 6th chapter. When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain. Jesse, did you get my body, soul, and spirit?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Anybody that would like to have a copy of it, it's a study that Pat Heil and I, this nice auburn-haired woman's husband down at the end there, did on body, soul, and spirit. And our conclusion was that instead of what I had thought, that the Bible taught a triune part, a 3-part human being, decided that's not so. Even though in one place in 1 Thessalonians he talks about preserving you body, soul, and spirit blameless until his appearing. But because that sounds like three different things. But when you analyze it both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, you'll come to find that there's only two parts of human beings, the outer person and the inner person. The outer person is always described as flesh or physical body or something like that. But the inner person can be described as heart, spirit, soul, inner man. That's on the ones that I can think of right now. So that's neither here nor there, but I want you to know that's what's here. This is the real life. The best translation of the word suke, often translated soul, is genuine life, who you really are. It's what makes you, you. Sometimes it's used, you remember when Stephen was preaching his sermon about the history of the disobedience of the Jews in the 7th chapter of Acts. He uses that 75 souls went down into Egypt, and that means 75 individuals. When Jesus says, what will a man give in exchange for his soul, it means life. What is as valuable to you as who you really are? Your essential existence, and that's what's meant here. Paul describes it as being naked in 2 Corinthians 5. That is, you are a self, but you don't have a body in which for that self to live. And he describes it as naked. And so that's what John saw, was these, language really fails us here. These selves, these individuals. Now, how would you recognize that? John saw it. But I suspect, this is a speculation, it's as good an explanation as I've got. I expect it's like a dream. Have you ever had a dream and you recognize somebody even though you don't see them, you don't actually have a vision of them, you just know who they are. Mm-hmm. And remember, I've explained that a prophet was in an altered state of consciousness. And so we are in an altered state of consciousness when we dream. That's the reason that a lot of the Old Testament prophets, the message came to them in dreams. And it's the same idea of an altered state of consciousness. And that's what he saw. Now, listen carefully to the description. I saw under the altar, and that's the great brazen altar, the altar of burnt offerings in the courtyard of the temple, the courtyard in front of the tabernacle. And in it, if you go back to the Old Testament and read a description, there's a channel that runs down the side of it into a reservoir, and the blood of the sacrificial animals drained into that. And so that's the symbolism you have here. Here are these people whose blood had been shed because they were witnessing their faith. Now, let's look at another idea here. When we say martyr, we know what we're talking about, or at least we think we do. But a martyr was somebody who was sacrificed because of his religion. There never was a religious martyr until the time of the Maccabees in about 165, 68 BC. Because until then, if you were, say, an Assyrian, you believed in the Assyrian gods and goddesses. But if Babylonian army came along and whooped the Assyrian army, all you did was just say, well, my gods were not strong enough, I'm going to believe in the Babylonian gods. And so there couldn't be any martyrs. The word martyr simply means a witness. When you shall not bear false witness, translated in Greek with the same word. And that's what a martyr is somebody who's witnessing their faith to Christ to the point of death. And that's what he's talking about here. And remember, the book of Revelation is to offer comfort to people who are facing the death from the mighty Roman Empire.
And you mentioned, I guess maybe last week, that the temple that John is seeing here is not the temple that's on earth, it's one that's in heaven? Or
It doesn't say temple.
I know, it just says, refers to
Under the altar.
Yeah.
So don't add something John didn't.
I thought you mentioned, and I couldn't remember whether he said this was not the temple, or that this was referring to the temple, the earthly temple. or-
The temple is not mentioned.
Okay.
So we got enough details and complications to deal with. Let's don't bring in one. Now,
You probably wouldn't see the temple itself
no,
because God's presence is there.
yes. I suspect that all he saw was the altar. And how did John recognize the altar? Because he'd probably seen the one in the temple at Jerusalem. Or, again, in that altered state of consciousness, he just knew what it was. I didn't give you those introductory details just to be talking, because I knew they would come in handy as we went on. So let's go on. He says, who'd been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they had maintained. See, that's testimony. They called out in a loud voice. Now notice how often in this the voices are loud. Did you ever,
Many.
what?
They're not only powerful, but there are many in this case.
Yeah, yes, and there is power. That's what a loud voice. Have you ever been, I never will forget the first football game I ever went to in LSU Stadium in Baton Rouge. They were metal framework with wooden benches on them. And when things got loud, they would put their feet on them, and it was impossible to hear yourself think. It's power. The noisiest football stadium in the National Football League is in Seattle, and quarterbacks of visiting teams just hate it because they have to use deaf and dumb language, almost signals, hand signals and everything to communicate. Okay, how long, sovereign Lord? Now there's a phrase. What does sovereign Lord mean to you? Anybody?
Mighty One.
What?
Mighty One.
Mighty One? That's good. What?
The King.
What?
The King.
The King? why would these people be using that designation for God?
He's in charge.
What?
He's in charge. He's in charge.
But why would it be particularly relevant to them? You've had this before.
There was a Roman government Caesar that had killed them or under that regime. So that is another way to talk about elevating God above that.
Yes. The word sovereign God, or the sovereignty of God, means He is God of gods, Lord of lords, King of kings, whatever you want to say. These people wanted to appeal to a higher power than Rome. Rome killed them. But they recognized something that many times we tend to forget today, that God is really in control of the world. I'm going to stop and give you a little sermonette right now because it's a pet peeve of mine. I get really tired of Christians who moan about how bad the world is. It's the worst time I've ever... You know what? That's prideful to say that. Because if it's the worst time in the world and I'm a Christian, guess what? I'm a better Christian than other people. It's not the worst time in the world. It won't hold a candle to what was going on in the Mediterranean world all the time. And in this country, we have some minor opposition, and we can't pray out loud in public school and all that. But those are frustrations, are minor problems. They are not what a person in northwest Nigeria faces for their faith. I had a friend who was a missionary in Nigeria. He taught in the missions department at Abilene Christian University. And back in the early 70s, they had a civil war. So that's before many of you were born. Not all of us. He had to leave. The State Department removed his visa and he had to fly out. They didn't want any Americans to be killed and us get involved in it. And he knew that the Igbo tribesmen who live in northwest Nigeria were overwhelmingly Christian. And the rebels were various kinds of animists or Muslim. And they would put them in concentration camps and killed them. And he just... visited with him during that time, and he just knew that the believers would just be about nearly wiped out. When he went back in the mid-70s, guess what? There were more Christians then than there were before, because they insisted on the sovereignty of God. And that's the thing we need to realize. I'm not saying we oughtn't to be concerned about evil and powerful wickedness in powerful places and so on, but we worship a sovereign God, one who not only made the universe, He controls it by the word of His mouth. He is seen by the Old Testament prophet says, Lord of history. He's the one who said, I know how things are going to end before I start doing them. And that's what sovereignty means. When you're feeling low and threatened, when you're feeling distressed, go with your problems, with your feelings, to the sovereign God, and it will surprise you how He will help you.
the Expanded Bible uses the word master here.
Yeah,
And to me, that connotates that these faithful souls knew who their master was. And it wasn't Rome, never would be Rome.
Yes.
It would always be the
See?
sovereign one.
but here is, now notice, here, and the people who originally read this letter or had it read to them, it would hearten them no end, because here was God taking care of those people that Rome had slaughtered. And they believed in that God. I was talking to you, Steve, about translating the New Testament has really, and I thought my faith was as strong as it could be. But as I read and ponder and have to find a way to say what they were saying, I'm strengthened. I said, as I told Steve, these fellows really meant it. And they really faced problems. They had tribulation. And because it's a word we're going to use right down a little later. But let's go on. How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true? The holiness of God is one of the unique features of biblical religion. None of the other gods and goddesses of the world at that time and subsequent times are holy. They act like kindergarten kids with own hormones. Own hormones, is it? But that's what holy and true. Now, I'm not sure. I haven't translated Revelation yet. I suspect this is the word aletheia.
It is.
Okay. Thank you. Which means, let me put it this way. The opposite, the antonym of aletheia, is not a lie. It's genuine. It's counterfeit. And so there's always, in the biblical word for truth, there is this aspect of it being real and genuine. The real thing. This God is genuine. This is the living God and the God of the living. And that's their security, is He is the God of the living. Even though Rome killed them, they are not dead. What is it? I am the resurrection and the life. Even if you die, you will live again. That phrase from John, same John who's writing and saw these visions. He's genuine. Our God is real. It seems to me there was a song or a hymn several years ago. Our God is real. Am I right? You said yes.
I'm thinking of that.
I think
Okay.
there was one that said, our God is alive, I think, you know,
Okay.
yeah.
But anyway, if there isn't one, there should be.
No, that was my favorite one. I hear.
Okay. All right. Until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood. Now here's one of the hardest things we human beings have to face, is allowing room for the vengeance of God. Whole cultures are built around the avenger of the blood. That's what has kept the ancient Near East killing each other for 5,000 or 7,000 years or so. They never forget. You killed my great, 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 great grandfather, and so I'm going to kill you. And you can put as many grates on that as you want to, and they still remember it. I never will forget going down into southeast Mexico between Veracruz and Tamuzunchale. And the people there will point to you, there's where Cortez fought a battle. There's where so-and-so. It's still, from 1519, it's still a living memory among the Indios, the native Indians, the Nahuatl and Mayan speakers in that area. Most of them speak, if they don't speak Spanish, they speak Nahuatl down in there. You go a little further though, and you find the Quiches.
That's right.
Which is a language. I'm always amazed to hear Pat speaking Quiche. It sounds a little bit like Ernie Pyle described Arabic. He said, to hear an Arab speak, it sounded like somebody had been stabbed in the throat and was strangling to death on their own blood. And there's clicks and there's gutturals and there's sounds that I don't think I could ever make. But that's what he's talking about here is, avenge our blood. Then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and brothers who were to be killed as they had been was completed. Now, this is a standard literary description in the Old Testament, well, in the Bible. And that is, there is a limit to people who are going to be killed. Now, we think about it's kind of cold-blooded or something, you know, but look at it from the opposite way. There's only going to be a limited number. And when that number is reached, then God, this is the same idea. When the gospel, and I'm going back to a Jewish idea, the time of the Messiah, there would be suffering attached to it, but when the suffering was full, then the Messiah would be triumphant. It's what Paul means when he says, I fill up in my own body the sufferings of Christ, the sufferings of the Messiah. And so,
It's kind of adding to, even in the judgment of the flood, and even of Sodom and Gomorrah, that they had reached a certain limit, and God now had to
act, yes. That's what I'm talking about, is that it's a, see, we take sometimes these phrases that are literary cliches or literary descriptions, we take very literally. Like, you know, there's 1,522, that's the number or something. They did not think in terms like that. They thought in terms of limit. And there's a limited, when that God knows you are suffering, and He has provided for you a place in a white robe, and wait a little longer. And when the number of people, the limit is reached, then God will intervene, just like He did in Sodom and Gomorrah. I never will forget.
These souls being the ones that died back then, the Romans,
Uh-huh.
as well as ones that are dying today for their faith? These martyrs?
I would have to say yes. Now that's a rational extension. But given my view of the way the book is structured, yes, the number would be through till the end, what we call the end of time, the reappearing of the Christ.
This would even be, it might have included Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but they didn't die, but they expressed the same kind of faith and testimony in saying, we'll go to fire furnace before we'll bow down to you.
Yeah.
Even if God doesn't save us.
Well, that's what I love about that Daniel passage is they said, we don't know. Our God can save us. We don't know whether he will choose to in our case or not, but whether he does or not, we're still going to obey him.
So this would cover people
It's-
like that? from-
That's
from
the
that-
same kind of idea. Okay. All right, let's go on. Wait a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and brothers who were to be killed as they had been was completed. I watched as he opened the sixth seal. Now, this is a standard thing we're going to see from now on. The sixth of seven is going to introduce the next event, the next minor section. And that's overlapping. It's like shingles. You overlap them. And so I watched as he opened the sixth seal. There was a great earthquake. Now, earthquakes. What is symbolic about an earthquake?
The anger of God?
What?
The anger of God?
That's one, but that is
Also his presence, it seemed like that was significant on Sinai, that his presence shook the mountain.
yes. What is there about an earthquake?
Scary.
Scary, yeah,
Destruction.
yeah.
It's sudden and no warning.
What about power?
Power again,
And they're
sure.
rumbling.
What kind of power does it take to make 100 miles north and south and 50 to 75 miles from east to west for the very earth to shake? And there's a place in California that you can actually see where there's
fault.
well, it's you see it on the surface. It's about 6 or 8 feet vertical displacement. There's not too many places you can do that, but there's a few.
There's also a very, what they call the Great Rift.
Yeah,
It's part of Africa and all of
Yeah.
Palestine.
Well, we're not going to get in plate tectonics, so but
Still.
you have to read my book for that.
Right.
Okay. All right. It is power. And the idea now, it is symbolic of the presence of God. That's what it meant at Sinai. Remember what the writer of Hebrews says? We come to a mountain, Mount Zion, which cannot be shaken. He's talking about the final power of God to bring us to a point where the earth no longer shakes, where we are stable and the people of God. But this is the power. Now, I want you to bear with me as we go through this description, because these are literary conventions. They're not literal. You can go into the Old Testament and find these same conventions, and they have to do with the day of the Lord, the day of God's intervention. Now, there's days of the Lord, just like there are, John says, many antichrists. There is one antichrist, I think. I'm not going to push that too hard. But there are many, John says. And so there are many days of the Lord, but then there is that day, or the day. It's the final intervention of God in history. A day of the Lord is the way God intervenes in history to change it.
What about the day of the cross and the earthquake then?
That was a day.
That's the most significant day
Yeah,
until this.
well, that's the reason I said that these periods of time covered in each one of these sections of the book of Revelation is from the time of the cross until he returns again. That period of time. But here it is, he says, great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made from goat hair. What would we call that?
Gunny sack,
What?
gunny sack, like a potato sack.
Goat's hair? They don't make gunny sack. They make that out of jute.
Truth.
It'd be bad wool.
What?
It'd be wool of some sort, rough wool.
Well, if it's Angora, what it is, the idea of the sun darkening is what happened when a great ancient city was sacked and burned. The smoke would cover the sun. We're going to see this again and again in the book of Revelation. We're going to see the final destruction of Babylon from the viewpoint of people who are wanted to go into Babylon and make money, and they're standing out in the plains and they're seeing their possibility of making money disappear as the smoke ascends and the sun turns black and the moon turns to blood. Have you ever seen the moon turn to blood?
It's most easy during an eclipse.
What?
It's most easy to see that during an eclipse, but it happens on other occasions when there's a lot of debris in the air.
Yes. I've seen enough dust in the air for the moon to turn red. What it is, if the particle size is a certain number of angstroms, it lets the long wave red light through, but it keeps the bluer light from coming. Just exactly like carbon dioxide doesn't let the ultraviolet light leave, it lets the light from the sun hit the earth, and then when it comes back as red long waves, it won't go through, it keeps it on the earth.
It kind of reflects it back.
Yes, reflects it back. Okay, that's what this is. Now, see, it's so easy for people to try to be literal about this. But if you read your Bible carefully, you will find that this is a literary convention to describe the intervention of God and the destruction. There's destruction here. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth as late figs drop from a tree when shaken by a strong wind. Now, again, stars falling. Have you ever heard the song, "The Stars Fell on Alabama"? Some of you are old enough to hear that.
Did they,
What?
they did the day Lindy was born.
This again was a literary convention. The people were firm believers in different forms of astrology, and falling stars was a sign that some great being or ruler or something was going to die. It was against the law, Roman law, to cast the horoscope of the emperor. Did you know that?
Later in Revelation, there'll be language about the dragon sweeping stars.
Yes.
So it's a thing.
Again, that's power. Okay, but this is power. In other words, when God, this is the answer to what the spirits of the martyrs have just said. Open the sixth seal, and God's judgment is coming on the earth. Remember in Habakkuk it says, God is in his heaven. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Now, we usually sing that song as if it were all, but it's not all that's meant. It's judgment. And that's what this means. When the people pray, God hears. And notice, now this is an important point. God uses the natural phenomena of the universe as tools to seek vengeance on people. Now, this is going to be, and I'm going to stop right here, and we may not go much further than this. It is so easy to do, like some preachers did after the hurricane hit New Orleans. The preacher got up, and said that hit New Orleans because they allow homosexuals to exist and things like that. That is not biblical teaching, because only God can know who he is punishing in hurricanes, and earthquakes, and other natural phenomena.
Who's to say that God is actually punishing somebody in those?
Yes, what I'm saying is only God can know. See, it's not for us to know. Now, the same event can have two different purposes, at least two, and maybe 24. Let's take a hurricane. Have you ever read about the man who was new at the Weather Bureau in Galveston in 1900? It's a great story. He had been the man that published a monograph on climatology that said hurricanes could never hit Galveston. Now, they did, and he lost members of his own family. Now, there were over 8,000 people that died. Of that 8,000, some of them were being punished by God. How many? Could have been as little as one. I doubt that it was 8,000. But let's say that of that 8,000, 4,000 were staunch believers. Now, they suffered the same fate. And that's going to seem to you like, that's not fair. But listen, it's going to say later on in the book of Revelation, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. When a believer dies, our death is qualitatively different from the death of an unbeliever. I'm not going to get into arguments about annihilation or anything, Mike, but it's different. Remember, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, said, comfort one another with these words. For well, he doesn't use the word death, but he said, it's different. We don't die in the same way. Now, well, that's not a good way to put it, because we can die in the same way, but not for the same reason.
We don't die in hopelessness.
That's right. See, I like that word hope, because that's a good biblical word. So remember that as we go on in this. And then he says, then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and every slave and every free man hid in caves and among the rocks and the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us, hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. Now there is one of the most oxymoronic phrases in the whole New Testament. Can you see a wrathful lamb? We usually see what?
No, she's thinking, I guess I never thought about that.
That's my job as a teacher, is to get you to think about it.
It's also not used very often in this.
What?
The wrath of the Lamb is not used a lot. We don't see that a lot.
I'm not sure, but this is the only place it is. It's the only one I know of. But it is done on purpose, because we can be confused about, we got the God of the Old Testament, and he's a God of wrath, but we have the Lamb who's slain from the foundation of the world, who died for us and all. But we need to realize that he is Lord. He is ruler. In fact, that's what we had in that throne room when the personage on the throne handed, right hand, the seal to carry it out. And what did he do? He went forth on a white horse with a golden crown, with his bow, conquering and to conquer. And the wrath of the Lamb, as oxymoronic as that sounds, that is the promise again of the prayer to the, it's the answer to the prayer of the martyrs. Notice there is the prayer and then the fulfillment. That's the reason these things are juxtaposed together.
We don't think of Jesus dying on the cross as something powerful. We think of it as he being conquered, like he was just meek and mild, and he went ahead and died on the cross for us. He performed a giant victory over death.
Yeah, you ought to read into right on that.
Yeah.
That's the way Paul does the same thing.
And so that's the same thing. This is the Lamb that has power.
Okay, remember what Paul says? He triumphed over the principalities and powers in the heavenly realms. Only on the cross. But the point I want you to see here is the comfort to the people facing this as a physical reality. They prayed, how long? And immediately the power of the sovereign Lord is brought to bear. Now, that means that God, during the whole period of what we call the Christian dispensation, or whatever you want to call it, God will intervene as he sees fit. Now, like so many believers, we want to know more and be smarter than the average bear. And so we have people who are going to tell you, I know exactly what God is doing here. Just write them off as ignoramuses, because they don't know. It is by faith that we know that God is intervening, that God is Lord of history. If things get to where God wants to change them, guess what he will do? He will intervene and change them. Now, it's our part in this, and I want you to hear this as we close this lesson. Our part in this is prayer. Our part is, if there's something wrong in the world, to pray.
That's what Monday was about.
Yes, every once in a while in my private devotions, I spend some time praying about places where there's war and famine. I prayed about people with Ebola in West Africa. I pray about people who are facing persecution. And I try to be as specific as I know. It's the only way that I can live with myself, because I know those things are evil, and it's not to the benefit of the people who are suffering. We are to pray. There's a special blessing in the Old Testament for people who pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Have you ever prayed for the peace of Jerusalem?
I do since I visited there.
What?
I do since I visited there.
Well, it was when they just kept getting all these constant assaults, those missiles.
Yeah.
Really getting to me.
And
So I started
now,
praying.
I do not pray that God kill Arabs or anything else. I pray for the peace of Jerusalem. I even like the phrase that closes out the Passover, the Seder, next year in Jerusalem. By the way, David Tasker and I put on the Seder. I can't remember how to pronounce it. Seder, that's right. Thank you. And with all the fixings, and it was a real enjoyable experience. I was the youngest at my age, asked the questions. Okay, now notice what happens when God intervenes. The unbelievers, the persecutors, run and hide. But of course, there is no place to hide. You cannot hide from God, but they try. And that's where we're going to stop tonight. Does everyone who's here have an outline? I'll get 2 or 3 more just in case we have him. And I want to ask you to read the next minor section, okay? And just so that you're familiar with it.